Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 3 wide receiver rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses thus far this season, on average, in a half PPR scoring format, have been giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers, giving us some perspective and insight as to which wide receivers have the most advantageous matchups going into Week 3. After we talk about matchups, we'll then transition to our top 36 wide receiver rankings in order to give you guys statistics to justify the reasons as to why I think the wide receiver position is going to stack up as such at the end of Week 3. After we cover all those topics, we'll be done tomorrow. We'll, of course, have our trade targets video, buy low, sell high. Friday, we have our must-start players. Saturday and Sunday, we live stream on both days. Saturday begins at 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So if you're interested, check that out. Again, for those of you who are interested in daily fantasy football content, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're bringing that in your direction for the singular purpose of trying to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship and win your weekly matchups as we progress towards that championship. Now, before we begin, of course, I want to remind you guys, if you have not yet already, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. For those of you who are trying to play more fantasy football on a weekly basis, whether it is drafting teams and competing in Thursday night contests, whether it is the Sunday battle royales where you can draft a full roster of players and you just compete against others. Winner takes all. A lot of fun to be had there. You could also compete in the pick'em segment where you're picking higher or lower on a given player statistic. We've done that a lot over the last couple weeks, showing you guys that. So again, if you guys are interested, check out the link down in the description and use promo code Andrew when you sign up today via Underdog Fantasy and make a first-time deposit. When using the code, you'll be given a deposit match up to $100. So if you're interested, check that out. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into this conversation regarding the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. Wide receiver statistics allowed by defenses as of the first 2 weeks of the season. The Baltimore Ravens, Los Angeles Rams, and Atlanta Falcons all lead the pack in that category. Of course, the Baltimore Ravens got completely torched in their secondary, and they've obviously dealt with a lot of injuries this season already, but this is almost identical to last year. The Baltimore Ravens in 2021 gave up the most points per game to opposing wide receivers in a half PPR scoring format. So really, it's going to be tough for them to recover from all the injuries they've already sustained this season, similar to last year, and be able to cover especially really good wide receivers, Tyreek Hill, Jaylen Waddle. They tore that defense apart. But either way, we talk about the Rams. They're giving up a lot of points in garbage time or to really good teams. Either way, that could be an advantage. The Atlanta Falcons, they've given up their fair share. DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, can they have breakout weeks here with Geno Smith under center? Of course, on the other end of the spectrum, we're talking about defenses like the Denver Broncos, New York Giants, which is quite a surprise to me, Carolina Panthers, San Francisco 49ers, Cincinnati Bengals, really not giving up many points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average. Now, as we progress throughout today's video, I will be referring back to these statistics as I typically do. You can see on screen fantasy points allowed. That is a direct correlation to the statistic I prior showed. And I also demonstrate a matchup star rating 1 through 5, 5 obviously being the best, and 1 obviously being the worst, giving you a little bit of an idea as to how I think these matchups play out for these players. But even if Cooper Kupp, for example, is in a bad matchup, we're starting him because he is an absolute stud. So let's get into this, talking about my top 36 wide receiver rankings on the week, beginning with Cooper Kupp taking on the Arizona Cardinals. In the first 2 games of the 2022 year, he has already put up 25.3 and 26.3 fantasy points. Cooper Kupp cannot be stopped. He's coming off of a week in which he played 100% of the offensive snaps, 11 catches, 108 yards, 2 receiving touchdowns against the Atlanta Falcons defense. He is literally their offense, and he's not coming off the field. He takes on Arizona and is a definite must start, as we all expect him to be. Moving on to Justin Jefferson on number 2, taking on the Detroit Lions. It's another one of these great matchups in my opinion. Even though Jeff Okudah has played well this season in comparison to his rookie year, he still has to take on Justin Jefferson, which is no easy task at all. Justin Jefferson, in the last 2 games that he played against his defense, absolutely went nuclear. 15.9 fantasy points and 30.1 in a half PPR scoring format. Already thus far this season, the Detroit Lions secondary has found themselves struggling, whether it was against A.J. Brown in week 1 or just this last week, Jahan Dotson, Curtis Samuel, Terry McLaurin, all of them finding a lot of success against that secondary. This is a pass-first scheme. Justin Jefferson is going to continue to get his 10-plus targets, and as long as that is going in his direction, he's going to get himself a lot of points. Moving on to Davante Adams, the thumbnail for today's video, taking on the Tennessee Titans. This is by far and away a 5-star matchup. If you guys watched on Monday night, just exactly what the Buffalo Bills were capable of accomplishing against that defense and secondary. We know that the Tennessee Titans secondary and coverage isn't great. They weren't great last year, and they really didn't make too many additions to go ahead and kind of patch up some of these holes that really need filling. Ultimately, this is going to be a game where Davante Adams can take over, because if Stefon Diggs can come out and put up 12 catches for 148 receiving yards and 3 receiving touchdowns, 38.8 fantasy points and a half PPR, and there's a conversation this week of Hunter Renfrow potentially missing due to the concussion that he sustained, I expect Davante Adams to have his numbers look eerily similar to week 1 rather than what we saw in week 2. Again, he only had 2 catches this last week. That's the first time since 2017 with Brett Hundley that he had 2 or fewer receptions in a singular game. I expect to go back to those 17 target range, probably not, but let's say 12 targets is in line for him this upcoming week. Moving on to Stefon Diggs. Speaking of Stefon Diggs and the nuclear performance he had in week 2, I mean, that was the second best fantasy performance in a half PPR he has ever had his entire career. And mainly because Gabriel Davis was out, and there may be a potential in which Gabriel Davis once again misses this upcoming weekend. If that's going to be the case, there's more and more opportunity available to Stefon Diggs that just looks incredible right now. Now, last season when he took on the Miami Dolphins, he was able to put up 2 pretty good performances, 14.0 and 12.5. Obviously not as great as this last week's performance, as he was able to put up 38, but nonetheless, we're talking about a wide receiver who's associated with one of the best quarterbacks in the league in a top-tier offense, along with a top-tier defense that continues to get them the ball back in advantageous positions. As of right now, obviously a must-play against Xavier Howard and the Miami Dolphins. Moving on to Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's moved into my top 5, and I didn't expect us to get here. If you had told me that Amon-Ra St. Brown would be in your top 5, Andrew, I probably wouldn't have believed you, but due to the circumstances and the streak continuing, I mean, we just have to have him in this conversation. Let's think about this, right? In the last 8 games that he has played, he's been averaging over 22 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. Not only that, he has an 8-game consecutive streak of 10 or more targets, 8 or more catches, and 64 or more receiving yards. And in the last 8 games, he has had 8 touchdowns. So overall, we're expecting 8 catches, 64 yards, and a touchdown. If we do the math on that, that's 16 plus points in a half PPR scoring format, which, yes, may not get him into that top 5 conversation, but just to put an emphasis as to how much I trust him going forward, I have him here. Moving on, let's talk about Ja'Marr Chase taking on the New York Jets defense. Okay, the New York Jets, their defense overall, especially in the secondary, hasn't really been tested per se as of thus far this season. They played against Cleveland last week, and Amari Cooper had himself an incredible game, but Amari Cooper was the only receiver that had more than 1 target in that game. Now, even when we go back to week 1, we saw Devin Duvernay have himself 2 receiving touchdowns and Rashod Bateman have himself a big 55-yard receiving touchdown. So why not Ja'Marr Chase? Why not T. Higgins? I think these guys are absolutely in line for a great performance. My biggest concern is the health of Joe Burrow. The guy has already been sacked 13 times this season. That offensive line that I was hyping up all offseason is terrible. They are not playing well. And yes, there are some coverage sacks where Joe Burrow has to try to scramble in the pocket because the coverage has pretty much locked down the play. But ultimately, this offensive line has not played well. It is apparent. It is visually apparent. Now, another one of these things that I wanted to mention, when T. Higgins has been healthy in the lineup with Ja'Marr Chase over the last 2 seasons, we have seen Ja'Marr Chase average 7.9 targets per game, while T. Higgins has averaged 8.0 targets per game. If we're going to get an even distribution between the two, their upsides are capped to an extent, but we're hoping that touchdown upside will be accompanying their performances, which will get them into the upper echelon, while some of these other wide receivers in this range are always getting 10 or more targets on a weekly basis. Moving on, let's talk about Tyreek Hill. Obviously coming off of a game in which he demolished that secondary for the Baltimore Ravens. We mentioned it last week. That secondary was beat up. Kyle Fuller went down with the ACL injury in week 1 against the New York Jets. Of course, Marlon Humphrey was dealing with an injury. Marcus Peters was only just coming back from his ACL. Another one of the corners, Stevens, was injured. There was so much to like about that matchup, and it only took a couple quarters, and Tyreek Hill completely went off. 36.5 fantasy points, 11 catches, 190 yards, 2 touchdowns. Now, this upcoming week, they take on Buffalo. And I'm sure we all know this is not going to be an easy contest. There's not going to be blown coverages. Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer are not going to allow that. When you're taking on a much tougher defense, you're going to get pushed to the limit. That being said, in the NFL playoffs, when Tyreek Hill was a part of the Kansas City Chiefs offense, the last time he played against the Bills, earlier this year, in fact, he had 11 catches on 13 targets, 150 yards, and a receiving touchdown against the Bills defense. Maybe, just maybe, he could have himself another great game here. Moving on to Deebo Samuel. With Deebo Samuel now having Jimmy G as his starting quarterback, we may be getting ourselves into a conversation where we get wide receiver Deebo Samuel back. There may be a conversation where you don't have to run him as much. Now, in the last 2 weeks, he has had 11.2 fantasy points in week 1 and 5.3 fantasy points in week 2, just coming from his rushing production alone. Now, even though that's the case, I expect this guy to line up out wide and be a primary wide receiver option for this offense. They may not need him to be that involved, getting 10 plus targets like we've seen in seasons past. But as of right now, I think this is something that could be a potential option that elevates his overall potential on a weekly basis, along with the fact that if their backfield is going to have injuries from not only Trey Lance, of course, Elijah Mitchell, and Tyrion Davis-Price, Deebo Samuel will be asked to carry the rock, potentially score even more touchdowns. Moving on to AJ Brown on number 9. AJ Brown has looked fantastic thus far this year. And, the fact that he was able to play so well in week 1 really did allow the other receiving threats of this offense, whether it was Quez Watkins, Devonta Smith, or even Dallas Goedert, to thrive in week 2. There was so much of a concerted effort to prevent AJ Brown from being that primary threat for Jalen Hurts in week 2 against Minnesota that, of course, they just kind of let the rest of the team beat them. And that's exactly what happened. This upcoming week, they take on the Washington Commanders. This is one of the worst secondaries in the league. They've been giving up a lot of points to opposing offenses, whether it has been the Jacksonville Jaguars or even last week against Amon-Ra St. Brown, who completely destroyed them on the ground through the air. Doesn't matter. Even though we did see AJ Brown have a little bit less targets this last week, he still led the team in targets. He's going to be the primary receiver. We're not worried about him. He has ultimate upside. Moving on to Jaylen Waddle. Again, we have to have him in this conversation. If you are going to come off of a game in which you had 19 targets, I mean, what an unbelievable number. I went ahead and I looked into the history books. There have only ever been 25 other wide receivers that have eclipsed 20 or more targets in a singular game. 11 catches, 171, 2 touchdowns against a, pretty beat up secondary. But hey, if opportunity is there, success is going to follow. Now, this upcoming week, they take on Buffalo. Like I mentioned in regard to Tyreek Hill, this is not an easy matchup. In fact, when you saw Jaylen Waddle with Tua play against his defense last year, Jaylen Waddle only put up 4.9 fantasy points. We're hoping that we're going to see a high volume of target for both of the primary wide receiver of this offense. And if that's going to be the case, they're going to get their opportunity. It's just a matter of whether or not they can outplay that Buffalo defense and find success. Moving on to Michael Pittman Jr. My expectation is that he's going to be healthy and ready to go. Taking on the Kansas City Chiefs may not be the easiest matchup, but you got to look at what exactly Mike Williams did last week against his defense. Mike Williams on Thursday Night Football in a short week came in without Keenan Allen in this offense as the primary threat. Went for 8 catches, 113 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown. When the Colts use Michael Pittman in that same capacity, similar to the way that they did in week 1, 9 catches, 121 and a touchdown against Houston, I expect a lot of success to be found. Hopefully he's healthy. He's ready to go. He gets a couple full practices this week that gives us confidence in starting him this upcoming weekend against the Chiefs. Moving on to Courtland Sutton. With Jerry Jeudy dealing with an injury, there is a potential that Jerry Jeudy plays. And if that's going to be the case, I still believe Courtland Sutton is a top 12 wide receiver option this week. In the last 2 weeks, he has very nearly been able to score a touchdown in both games, but due to either penalties or his shoe size just being one size too big, making the difference. I mean, week 1 had a penalty against him, which was a defensive pass interference that prevented him from going ahead and scoring that touchdown. And then you go ahead and you get into week 2. It was also a defensive pass interference play, yet he still came down with the ball on a 40-yard reception. On the 1-yard line, they ran a fade route. He caught it. After further review, we have a situation where his toe is just on a singular blade of grass, and they go ahead and call that back. The next play they come out there, they throw another fade to him, incomplete. They wanted him to get involved, but nonetheless, 11 targets, 7 catches, 122 this last week. He's going to continue to be the primary number 1 of this offense, a big body threat down the field. Russell Wilson leads the league in deep passing attempts down the field, 20 or more yards. Courtland Sutton, a fantastic option against the San Francisco 49ers defense. And the main stat that I wanted to mention that I had, graphicked out here, 2 games already this season, okay? The amount of fantasy points he's already put up, despite the fact that he has scored 0 touchdowns thus far, is the equivalent of 21% of his total fantasy points last year. And that's literally in only 2 games. A lot of potential for the pace of Courtland Sutton going forward. Now that we've gone ahead and covered our top 12 wide receiver ones for this upcoming week, we'll go ahead and demonstrate them on screen. Again, rankings are subject to change. Do not forget, as the week progresses, injuries will go ahead and potentially plague players. So we're always trying to keep you guys up to date. That's what our Sunday morning live stream is for, in order to give you guys up-to-date rankings on screen at all 4 primary positions in order to help you guys out and help you win. So be sure to come on by Sunday morning. Hopefully the live stream will work this week and we'll be good to go. Outside of that, let's go ahead and move on. All right, let's talk about Mike Williams, our number 13, taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars defense. I don't know what the status of Keenan Allen is as of this current moment in time, but it doesn't really matter. The pure difference maker is whether or not Justin Herbert is going to be active. If Justin Herbert is active, I can anticipate Mike Williams to have himself a big game against the Jacksonville Jaguars secondary that purely can be exposed by this Los Angeles Chargers offense. Now, anytime Mike Williams has been given 7 or more targets in 2021 or in 2022, he's averaged 18.72 fantasy points per game. If you want to get him involved in this offense, he's going to find success. It's only in those scenarios where he's not getting a high volume of targets where he disappears and is an inconsistent option. Outside of that, if you give him the ball, he's going to find success. He's going to get us fantasy points, and he's going to win us weeks. Moving on to our number 14, we have T. Higgins. In the same vein in which I talked about with Ja'Marr Chase, this offensive line has played terribly. And that in itself has prevented Joe Burrow from having an extended period of time in the pocket to find these wide receivers down the field. Yet, with that all being mentioned, we have still seen this team get the ball in the direction of T. Higgins at a pretty consistent rate. Again, this last week, 10 targets, 6 catches, 71 yards, and a touchdown against that Dallas Cowboys secondary. 16.1 fantasy points coming off the concussion from week 1. That was quite unfortunate. But again, in 7 out of the last 11 games that he has played, he's been able to put up 70 or more receiving yards in this offense. Ultimately, he is a consistent part of this team, and I expect him to continue to get this kind of utilization. They take on the New York Jets. We've seen a lot of wide receivers over the last couple of weeks. We've seen Rashod Bateman, Amari Cooper, all find success against them. And as long as T. Higgins is getting himself, 8 targets per game while he plays with Ja'Marr Chase, who's getting 7.9 targets per game, when they play together, I'm expecting him to be just as viable of an option going into this week. Moving on to Michael Thomas, our number 15. I think I speak for all of us when I say that I'm extremely happy to see him succeed. The fact that he has been able to put up 3 receiving touchdowns in the first 2 games of the season is incredible. He's only had 3 targets inside the 10-yard line and has been able to come up with a touchdown in every single one of those scenarios. In fact, he's number 7 amongst all receiving options in targets inside the 10. So as long as Jameis Winston continues to look in his direction in that capacity, that is perfect. They take on the Carolina Panthers, who really haven't had difficult matchups in the last 2 weeks, taking on the Cleveland Browns and the New York Giants. Those wide receiver threats really weren't big difference makers in those games. So as of this current moment in time, when I think about the potential of Michael Thomas, I'm hoping he's going to continue to play 80% of the offensive snaps and get a high volume of targets. But in comparison to the other receiving options in this offense, Michael Thomas has had 17 targets in the last 2 weeks, while Chris Olave and Jarvis Landry, they've had themselves consistent targets as well. Their numbers being 16 and 14. If we're going to see the number 2 and 3 wide receiver of this offense get a high volume of targets, of course, there's a potential that they could score, kind of diminishing the value of a Michael Thomas. But we're hoping he's going to continue to be that guy in the red zone that they continue to send the ball towards. Moving on to our number 16, we have Christian Kirk. Man, Christian Kirk has been playing out of his absolute mind. In the first 2 weeks of the season, he has already demonstrated just why the Jacksonville Jaguars paid him all that money. Week 1, over 100 receiving yards on 6 catches. This last week, another week of 6 catches, 78 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. But what was the biggest difference maker when watching those games was that they were designing plays specifically to get him open. His first receiving touchdown, he lined up out of the backfield. He ran himself a vertical route and was just easily in the end zone with very little tight coverage in that capacity. The second play in which he scored a touchdown, down on the goal line, they run him across the formation. And what do you know? He's wide open because he's the fastest guy on the field and everyone's thinking run on the goal line. If they're going to continue to design plays for him, he's going to be in a great position. He's currently the number 7 overall wide receiver in a half PPR, averaging over 18 fantasy points per game. Those kind of numbers are crazy. As of right now, the Los Angeles Chargers secondary, they are good, but there are definitely some points there that you can expose and find success. Moving on to Marquise Brown, our number 17. I'm just waiting for a good Cardinals jersey with this guy. Eventually, we're going to find one, but nonetheless, they take on the Los Angeles Rams. What we saw from the Rams in the last 2 weeks, besides week 1 getting blown out by Gabriel Davis, Isaiah McKenzie, Stefon Diggs, and then this last week, we saw, Drake London have himself an incredible game. But we got to remember, the score of that game was 28-3. A lot of those points that Drake London put up was garbage time. But hey, That's just the nature of fantasy. We're going to take that. We want those kind of scenarios. And what we've seen over the last 2 weeks from the Arizona Cardinals is that they start slow. They are not able to, put up much points in the first half. So if we're once again going to see this team start slow, well, you're going to have to go ahead and come back in the second half. And you're going to have to make plays. And you're going to have to wait and get those garbage time touchdowns that we're all expecting. Now, last week, his performance of 9.8 fantasy points and a half PPR wasn't great, but 11 targets, 6 catches, 68 yards is fantastic. But for those of you who didn't watch the game, there was a play in which he caught the ball and was literally 1 inch away from scoring a touchdown. He fell down at the 1 inch line. Honestly, in my opinion, I would have gave him the touchdown because by the time his knee hits, that ball is almost crossing the plane. But, I'm obviously trying to get us more fantasy points. I'm being biased in that regard. Nonetheless, he could have scored a touchdown, could have himself another 15-point performance, but unfortunately, not the case. This week, we're hoping for another one of those big games from him. Moving on to Curtis Samuel. It's easy to say that Curtis Samuel has been the best waiver wire pickup thus far this season. The guy's averaged 10 targets per week in the last 2 games. I mean, Ron Rivera brought him in 2021 to be exactly this. Obviously, 2021 dealt with a lot of those injuries, but now we have ourselves in a conversation where he's the primary number 1 receiving option of this offense in terms of targets, in terms of utilization, in terms of red zone threat and prowess. The fact that he's also able to get himself involved in the rushing game continues to expand upon his overall potential. Now they take on the Philadelphia Eagles. It is a in-division rival matchup, and it's a Carson Wentz revenge game. We're hoping, like other revenge game quarterbacks like a Matthew Stafford, Tom Brady, Russell Wilson, that the offense doesn't start slow. But even if they do, similar to last week against the Detroit Lions, that second half, they're going to roll back. They're going to find success, and Curtis Samuel is going to help lead the way in the receiving game. Moving on to CeeDee Lamb. Listen, CeeDee Lamb, proved me wrong purely. I think I had him as my number 31 wide receiver last week. He had himself a great game in comparison to what I was expecting with Cooper Rush at the quarterback position. In the 2 games he played with Cooper Rush, he had himself 6 catches, 112 receiving yards. That was last year against the Minnesota Vikings. And then this year, of course, just last week, 75 receiving yards, 7 catches on 11 targets. The fact that he was able to get 11 targets, and I think to myself, man, why wasn't Dak able to get him 11 targets per game every single game of last year? My brain just can't even compute it at that point. But nonetheless, if he's going to continue to be a primary option in this offense, I know that the New York Giants, Adoree Jackson, they've played well in terms of stopping wide receivers. I still think that if they're going to get him 11 targets and he's going to catch a wide majority of them, he's going to have himself success and maybe even have himself a touchdown that elevates his overall week. Moving on to Brandin Cooks, our number 20. Brandin Cooks in each of the last 2 weeks should have had a receiving touchdown. Similar to a Courtland Sutton, maybe even a Marquise Brown. But nonetheless, Brandin Cooks is still one of these top-tier wide receivers. He's still playing 92% of the offensive snaps, getting himself 10 targets per game while playing with Davis Mills. This last week had himself 10 targets, 4 catches, 54 yards, had himself a 6-yard pass in which it literally ricocheted off his hands, could have been a receiving touchdown, had himself a great week. Week 1, of course, that Hail Mary flea flicker pass, Davis Mills just threw it short. Otherwise, we had ourselves a 60-yard touchdown. Nonetheless, he's a fantastic wide receiver. In my opinion, a good matchup against the Chicago Bears defense. And secondary, Brandin Cooks, another one of these plays every single week. Moving on to Drake London, the rookie wide receiver out of USC. Now, this last week, of course, he had himself a lot of garbage time fantasy points, but I'm not holding that against him. I love seeing garbage time fantasy points. Whenever we see Marcus Mariota specifically funnel targeting Drake London, that gives us confidence. It lets us know, yes, we are going to continue to get him the ball down the field. And that in itself gives me confidence to have him in a top 24 capacity and rank him as my number 21 wide receiver going into this week, especially considering he has a Seattle Seahawks matchup, which in my opinion is quite favorable. And from what we've been able to see from this offense, specifically out-targeting Kyle Pitts at a pretty wide capacity, again, thus far this season, Drake London, 19 total targets, Kyle Pitts, 10 targets, and even Cordero Patterson with minimal utilization out of the backfield in a receiving capacity. As of right now, they're designing plays to get Drake London the ball. A lot of screen passes, a lot of, hey, use your big body as a threat. Make plays after the catch. Make, possession catches against contested targets that potentially goes 50-50. But we know that you're talented enough to go up and make those plays. And that's what I'm hoping is going to continue to be the case. That's why we have him here at 21. Moving on to Allen Robinson. Allen Robinson could have very easily had himself a second touchdown on Sunday against the Atlanta Falcons secondary, but unfortunately, they literally whistled the play dead almost during the play itself because of an injury. He came down with a reception. Either way, he could have had himself 20 fantasy points, but who's counting? I am, obviously. The only thing that kind of gets me more and more excited is obviously Down in the red zone, they're getting him more utilization, giving him more looks, which is fantastic. We obviously want to see his target numbers rise, but that's going to take some time. Nonetheless, they take on Arizona. When Cooper Kupp has played against Arizona in the last 3 games that he's played against them, 2 during the regular season last year, 1 during the NFL playoffs, he put up 8.9, 24.8, and 14.6. 2 of those games were literally Cooper Kupp's worst games in the last 23 that he has played. Maybe Arizona knows how to stop him to an extent, and if they do, Allen Robinson could get more utilization this upcoming week. Moving on to Diontae Johnson, our number 23. Regardless of the quarterback play, Diontae Johnson, once again, another week of 10 targets. We love to see that. Now, this upcoming week, they take on the Cleveland Browns. This is an in-division matchup. They are very familiar with one another. Last season, Diontae Johnson against his defense, 12.8 and 13.1 fantasy points. Has already demonstrated that he's comfortable against his defense. Now, it's a matter of whether or not Mitchell Trubisky is going to be able to find success. We've looked around the field. Outside of Pat Freiermuth, none of these other receiving targets are really, jumping out as Mitchell Trubisky's favorite. So Diontae Johnson, he's going to get his opportunity, and it's going to have to be a game in which Trubisky lets the ball rip. I mean, we saw what Joe Flacco did against this Cleveland defense. We need quarterbacks to just continue to pressure this defense, get the ball out of their quarterback's hands quickly, and allow their receivers, like we saw last week, Garrett Wilson destroying this defense, make a lot of plays. Hopefully Diontae Johnson will be in that scenario. Moving on to our final of the top 24 wide receivers. We talk about Rashod Bateman. In the first 2 weeks of the season, he has made big plays. Week 1 had himself a 55-yard receiving touchdown. Week 2 had himself a 75-yard receiving touchdown. As of right now, Lamar Jackson is number 3 amongst all quarterbacks in deep passing attempts of 20 or more yards, only behind Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston. Lamar Jackson is letting it rip, and if you're going to continue to be amongst the top of the deep passing category, of course, you will always have the potential for upside to make these big plays. He's been their go-to in that category, and if that's going to be the case, going up against the New England Patriots defense, they're going to have their hands full. I'm expecting Rashod Bateman to have himself another big week here. Whether it does accompany a touchdown, that's up in the air. But as of right now, even with his overall receiving yardage, even if he doesn't find the end zone, he's still a valuable prospect. All right, let's go ahead. Let's show you guys our 13 to 24 overall wide receiver rankings for week 3. Again, do not forget, rankings are subject to change. We will change these as the week progresses, so be sure to stay up to date on my latest content. All right, let's go ahead. Let's move into the wide receiver 3 conversation, beginning with Gabriel Davis. Gabriel Davis takes on the Miami Dolphins. I have him specifically at 25 because injury, ankle, TBD. I am not 100% certain whether or not he's even going to play. I thought he would have a potential chance of playing on Monday night. Obviously was not ready to go. So we're in a scenario where he may even miss a second consecutive week, which will certainly help the overall potential of Stefon Diggs, Dawson Knox. But if he ends up going this upcoming week, I want to play him. He is a very dynamic wide receiver that not only has a red zone threat, but also has the potential of catching a ball, going for 50 yards and a touchdown over the top of a defense like we have seen Stefon Diggs do in the last couple weeks. Ultimately, I think it's a good matchup. And as long as he's healthy, I want him in my lineup. But as of right now, we're not certain as to what his status is. Therefore, we leave him at 25. Number 26 is a very similar situation. We have Keenan Allen here because I don't know what his scenario looks like. He's dealing with a hamstring injury, obviously missed the Thursday night game against the Kansas City Chiefs. It was a short week in comparison to when he had sustained the injury on Sunday in week 1 against the Las Vegas Raiders. That all being mentioned. If he is able to play, he is in my lineup. He's a top 24 wide receiver. We know to play Keenan Allen. I mean, he has averaged 14 fantasy points per game over the last 2-3 years with Justin Herbert under center. But that's the biggest question there. Is Justin Herbert going to be under center? We'll have to keep that all monitored. As of right now, kind of keeping Keenan Allen's hamstring, seeing whether or not he's going to get a full capacity of practice this week, whether or not Justin Herbert is going to see the same. Those are all the questions that we're waiting to see as the week progresses. Moving on, we have DJ Moore as our number 27. Listen, DJ Moore's overall target opportunity in this offense has been awful. The fact that Baker Mayfield is, just as last week had himself a 8% passing completion percentage. Anytime your quarterback is in that conversation, it is a bad thing. Now, luckily for DJ Moore, he's always found a lot of success against the New Orleans Saints secondary. Since 2019, he has been averaging 17.32 fantasy points per game against this defense. While Marshawn Lattimore is the kryptonite of Mike Evans, I think it may be the opposite way, where DJ Moore is the kryptonite of Marshawn Lattimore. There may be a lot of potential here for this young wide receiver, DJ Moore, to have himself success here. It's just up to whether or not Baker Mayfield can help him elevate to that level. Moving on to Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper really did benefit from the fact that there was a complete pivot in terms of total targets. In week 1, Donovan Peoples-Jones came out and had himself 11 targets. While in week 2, Donovan Peoples-Jones had himself 1 target. and Amari Cooper had 10. So we saw ourselves a little bit of a shift here. Now, even though Donovan Peoples-Jones could have had himself a receiving touchdown if he wasn't wearing such a big shoe and didn't step out of bounds just on the outside line, just barely there, Amari Cooper wouldn't have had his touchdown because the play right after Amari Cooper scores. But the ability to get 10 targets, 9 catches, 101 receiving yards, and a touchdown, even if he doesn't score a touchdown, I'm confident in the potential of Amari Cooper on Thursday night against the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. There's going to be a lot of running to be done, but that play action will continue to open itself up, considering how much success Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt find on a weekly basis behind that incredible offensive line. As long as Jacoby Brissett is healthy and ready to go, Amari Cooper should be a great play. Moving on to our number 29, Garrett Wilson, the guy that we picked up off of waivers this week. And for those of you who listened in week 1, maybe you went ahead and just added him as a deeper threat on your bench just in case he panned out. And by all means, he did. This upcoming week, they take on the Cincinnati Bengals. And really, I don't care what Garrett Wilson does in between the 20s. When, in fact, the Jets get into the red zone, they're going to be sending the ball in his direction. As of right now, he leads all receiving options in the National Football League in red zone targets inside the 10-yard line. 7 total targets that have led to a lot of touchdowns. So as long as we're in that conversation, he's getting that opportunity and utilization, and they're designing plays to get him open, by all means, Garrett Wilson against Cincinnati should be a pretty good play. Let's not forget, the Jets did end up beating Cincinnati last year. Could have another one of these upsets. If we see the Bengals fall to 0-3, is it over? Like, is their season done? Let me know down in the comment section what you think. Either way, moving on. To number 30, Jakobi Meyers. He takes on the Baltimore Ravens matchup. They gave up a boatload of points to Tyreek Hill, Jaylen Waddle. I mean, they just really couldn't stop a soul on that defense. Nonetheless, we sit in a scenario in which Jakobi Meyers obviously is the number 1 wide receiver option of this offense in terms of targets, in terms of receptions, all of the above. But he's never going to score a touchdown for you. In fact, in the last 19 games, regular season, that he has played with Mac Jones, he's only scored 1 receiving touchdown from Mac Jones. The other one that you guys may be thinking about was from Brian Hoyer. That, in my opinion, concerns me. He doesn't have that overall touchdown upside. If he finds it, that's incredible. But I think the yardage and the receptions, that's going to be his overall play for this week. Moving on to Terry McLaurin. My biggest concern with Terry McLaurin is that Darius Slay has really given him trouble in the past. If, in fact, they get Terry McLaurin covered by James Bradbury, the number 2 corner, oh, by all means, that's the play we want to go ahead and take advantage of. But it's a matter of what we end up seeing this week. Last year, against the Philadelphia Eagles defense, he only put up 6.1 and 9.6 fantasy points. Obviously, not great performances. We are going to have ourselves a scenario where he's most likely the number 2 in terms of target opportunity in this offense behind Curtis Samuel. And he's pretty much sandwiched in between Jahan Dotson being that touchdown threat for this team. Overall, I expect Terry McLaurin to hopefully have himself a great game. Just worried about that coverage. We saw what happened to Justin Jefferson. Mainly had to do with the fact that Kirk Cousins wasn't playing well. But you never know. This revenge game for Carson Wentz could get to his head and cause a lot of problems for this offense. Moving on, we have DK Metcalf as our number 32. He has an incredible matchup. If it wasn't for the fact that DK Metcalf's 50-yard reception was called back because of a penalty this last week, he would have had himself a 10-point fantasy game. Minus 5 points to the overall production definitely does hurt. But the stat that I first and foremost wanted to mention, besides the fact that this defense has given up the 3rd most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average, is the fact that they've given up a 77.27% catch rate to opposing wide receivers. That's the 2nd highest rate amongst all defenses in the league thus far. The highest would be the Minnesota Vikings against opposing wide receivers, giving up a 80% catch rate, which is quite crazy. DK Metcalf has potential. It's just a matter of whether the matchup elevates him to get to that conversation. Moving on to JuJu Smith-Schuster. The fact that he was able to find so much success in the first half of week 1, then obviously kind of slows down with the shoulder injury. Short week against the Los Angeles Chargers, doesn't find much success there. As of right now, we look at what exactly Christian Kirk was able to do against his defense last week, utilize from the slot position, and think to ourselves, if they're able to get any sort of opportunity in the direction of JuJu Smith-Schuster, he should be able to find success. When we think about who the number 1 wide receiver for the team is, it's not Marquez Valdes-Scantling. It's not McCole Hardman. Of course, Travis Kelce's a tight end, even though he's the number 1 receiver. But the number 1 wide receiver of this team is JuJu Smith-Schuster. So I'm hoping that he's going to begin to show that off in the upcoming week, and especially this week against Indianapolis. Moving on to our number 34, Brandin Aiyuk. With Jimmy G back in the lineup, we got to remember that in the last 10 games that they have played together during the regular season, Brandin Aiyuk has averaged 11 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. Patrick Surtain may be out. Of course, he dealt with an injury, left the game last week. We know Justin Simmons, their prime all-star safety, not in the conversation. He's on the injured reserve. The secondary will be missing pieces, and if in fact we see a lot of Brandin Aiyuk lining up outside the numbers, we could find ourselves a lot of success with Jimmy G under center. Moving up to Tyler Lockett. I didn't expect to mention Tyler Lockett at any capacity, but considering the intensity of this matchup and how much success has been found against them, and the fact that Tyler Lockett is coming off of a week in which he somehow had 9 catches on 11 targets for 107 receiving yards, very so quietly, had himself a great week against San Francisco. I'm expecting that DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, even with JuJu Smith under center, to find success this week. Moving on to our final wide receiver. I'm not giving up on Adam Thielen. I feel like the week that I do give up on him, he'll score 5 touchdowns and just completely, my brain will just melt at that point. I'm expecting touchdown upside. They take on the Lions. It is a far easier matchup than what they had to face against that Eagles secondary. And as of right now, I know that they're a pass-heavy team. They're a pass-first team. And eventually, they're going to have to get Adam Thielen far more utilization than we've seen thus far this season. Number 36 is a perfect spot. But let me know down in the comment section, what players did I not mention today? Allen Lazard, Devonta Smith, Jahan Dotson. Are there players that you think deserve to make the list? Who are you starting as your starting wide receivers this week? Let me know down in the comment section. Thank you, everybody, for watching. This will cover today's wide receiver rankings video for week 3. Do not forget to subscribe, click the like button, and of course, check out Underdog Fantasy. If you sign up today using promo code Andrew and make a first-time deposit, you get a first-time deposit match up to $100. Check that out. Play fantasy football the Underdog way. And until tomorrow, we'll be talking about trade targets. I'll see you guys. Peace.